So Flo there with Not on Drugs. And talking about not on drugs, what about the new law that's coming in? The first law to shake up drug driving for 85 years, and that's coming in on Monday the 2nd of March. And joining us now to discuss this is Alison Ashworth, Head of Motoring Law at Foster Dean Solicitors. Hello, Alison.
Hello.
Hi, welcome to BCB.
Thank you. Pleasure to speak to you.
Right, so tell us about this new law then.
Well, on the 2nd of March, a new law comes into force which makes it an offence to drive with certain drugs in a person's system over specified limits. Now, it sounds quite complicated, but in reality it's not. And in fact, it's much more clear than the legislation which prosecutions have used up until the present time. The old law will continue to be in force, but there are key differences between the old law and the new law. The main one, of course, being that under the old law, it was an offence to drive with a drug in a person's system, and that drug could be something as simple as paracetamol or hay fever tablets. But the key thing was that it had to affect the person's manner of driving, so they would have to be impaired by it. And that was actually quite difficult for the prosecution to do. I know this myself as a defence lawyer. They would have to prove that the person had taken a drug and that drug affected their manner of driving as opposed to anything else. So under the new law, it's simply enough for the prosecution to prove that the substance was in a person's system and that it was over the prescribed limit. So it's no longer necessary for the prosecution to prove that anybody driving was impaired so long as the drug is above the specified limit.
Well, it's really interesting what you said there. I mean, how is that going to be managed in the sense of, reducing police numbers and, cuts in government spending? How are we going to kind of administer this so it becomes more effective?
Well, actually, it's going to make frontline policing much easier. What they intend to do for two of the illegal drugs covered by the offence, cocaine and cannabis, is to roll out roadside drugalyzer devices, similar to a breathalyzer, but with these, they basically rub something on the inside of your mouth, and then the test comes up a bit like a pregnancy test within 7 to 8 minutes. That would detect the presence of the drug in a person's system, and then they can be taken straight to the police station, and it will no longer be a requirement for them to be assessed by a doctor to give consent. Whereas previously a person had to undertake impairment tests, etc., the walk and turn, touch your nose, that kind of thing that you see in America. They will probably still have to do that for the other drugs that are covered under the offence. But the key thing is that they're streamlining everything now so that it's much quicker to get people processed. For the other drugs that are used for medicinal purposes, that is going to be more tricky because they can only be detected via a blood sample. And ultimately, for all of the drugs covered under the new offence, it will be a blood sample which the prosecution rely on in order to secure a conviction. But it's just the early detection stage which is going to be made more streamlined, and it's going to be easier for people to be prosecuted without the requirement to prove impairment.
Can I just ask you about this prescription medication thing? Because under the Equalities Act, we look at disability discrimination, and people don't have to disclose their employer, particularly if it's a hidden disability or medication that they're on, if it doesn't affect their actual work and they're not asking for reasonable adjustments or whatever. Under this law, if you're blood tested because and not done anything bad, but you happen to need to drive for work, and suddenly you're blood tested and you're found to be containing certain drugs, etc. I mean, what are the kind of implications for all that, and how the disclosure would happen with your employer and so forth?
Well, that's a really, really important point that you've raised, because a lot of concern has been raised by this offence. People think that they're going to have to stop taking their medication or stop driving, but that's simply not the case. The government estimates that 19 million prescriptions per year are issued for the drugs covered under this offence, and we're talking things like diazepam, morphine, temazepam. So people do take this medication quite regularly, but the law has been written in such a way that the limits for therapeutic medication have been set very high. So they've actually been set within or slightly above normal therapeutic doses. So it's unlikely that somebody who is a regular user of prescription medication is going to be caught out by this offence. They may have their blood tested, but it's unlikely to be above the specified limit. If, however, it is above the specified limit, then there's a medical defence available to them. So if they've taken the medication and it's been personally prescribed to them, and they've taken it in accordance with the prescribing instructions, and they've adhered to time limits when they should refrain from driving, then they will be free from prosecution. They'll be able to raise this defence and they won't be convicted. So they won't necessarily need to disclose anything to their employer because it wouldn't be a conviction on their record.
Okay, Alison, I want to ask you this question. I mean, I get the impression, probably pessimistic here or whatever, but that people are going to get stopped for no reason, and it's going to just prevent them from doing what they believe they should naturally do. About people breaking the law and using illegal drugs and that, but this is going to give the opportunity for the government and the police to just stop people being themselves. I mean, how many cases have been caused by accidents of people being intoxicated, for want of a better word, with drugs?
I think the RAC estimated that around 200 last year were caused by people who were found to have been impaired by drugs. But they suspect that that's a relatively conservative figure because people aren't routinely checked for drugs like they are in the same way as they are with alcohol. Alcohol, for example, the figures are much more high because people, whenever they have an accident, it's routine. They get breathalyzed. So I suspect that the figures will increase. Whether that's an accurate reflection of the amount of people, I don't think more people are going to be drug driving, but I think that more attention will be paid to whether or not a person has drugs in their system. I don't think that normal prescription users will be negative. I don't think they'll be targeted. I think this is mainly to target illegal drug takers and people who abuse prescription medication. So I don't think that the general population as a whole need to be concerned. If anybody is concerned and they are taking any of the prescribed medication listed in the new offence, then what I would recommend is that they carry with them evidence that they are legitimate users of that medication, so that they're not inconvenienced. If they do feel that they've been pulled over and they're being targeted, then they can simply pull out their prescription and, if possible, a letter from their doctor explaining that they are prescribed this medication and these are the doses that they've been prescribed it in, and that should streamline the whole process. But in reality, I don't think many people are going to be pulled over unless there is evidence of bad driving to start with.
A lot of the time, when you get something over the counter at the pharmacy or a doctor prescribes it for you, it says sometimes on them, may cause drowsiness. If affected, do not operate machinery or drive. And it's kind of like one of these sort of cover-all statements. But the person who is affected, the person taking the medication in a legitimate way, may not know they're affected, for one thing. But do you think this may alter the behaviour of pharmaceutical companies concerned about liability themselves, and ended up with suits against them, just slapping on do not drive on literally everything just in case?
I'm not sure. I can't see that happening because what the guidance that has been issued to the pharmaceutical companies and to pharmacies and to GPs is basically to continue prescribing in the way that they've been doing previously, because the old law is still in effect. The liability aspect is still there. The liability is for the old law, whether or not somebody is impaired by their driving. That's not relevant to the new one. So people still need to be aware that if they are affected in any way by, even if it's not a drug listed on this offence, even if it's hay fever pills, if you're affected, then don't drive. And the best way to test whether or not a person is likely to be impaired is simply to take the drug and then avoid driving until you know how that medication is going to affect you as an individual.
Well, on that piece of advice, I think we're going to have to leave it there. The time is against us, but thank you so much for joining us, Alison, and I'm sure this is something that we're going to be quite interested in over the coming weeks and see how it actually pans out in reality once it's actually in place as well. So thank you for joining us, and I'm sure